Okay, so you saw the demo on Node and Postgres, and here are some slides to go along with it. Database management systems are going to be handling our databases for us, right? They're going to end up doing all of our CRUD operations. Again, internally, they're going to be doing things with indexes or optimizing things as best they can. What we're going to end up doing is writing queries to get our data. So there's a little bit of a history of these databases, right? Older databases, things where it ended up getting stored on tapes. Relational databases came into being in the 1970s. This guy, E.F. Codd, who was at IBM, he had a very famous expression about primary keys. It was like how you could tell if it's a primary key, the whole key, and nothing but the key. Something about Codd instead of God. I forgot the whole expression, but you could look it up. And now you actually have NoSQL databases as well, which end up getting used sometimes for performance issues or for storing documents. So here are some relational database systems that you could use. We're going to use Postgres. By the way, I think that probably if this was done maybe 3 or 4 years ago, you might end up using MySQL, but people started to shy away a little bit. I think MySQL ended up getting bought by Oracle, and so Postgres seems to be a pretty popular database. People use MySQL as well. So it's a little bit different. We've seen this where Postgres ends up getting run on a server. It's not like you could have a file like you could have with SQLite. That's the big difference. So it's very heavily supported. You could end up using it remotely, which you've seen in the demo where we ended up having a database server that was set up for us, and we could end up accessing it. Some history of Postgres, why it's called Postgres, but again, big adoption by the open source community. How do you end up accessing Postgres? Well, you've actually seen that you could use pSQL to access Postgres. There's also some other tools that you could use. I haven't used this, a PG CLI that also will give you access to your Postgres server. There's also something that looks a lot more database driven, which you could use. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not positive of this, but this could possibly be something that was a capstone project. I'm not sure. I've never used it. But also, again, other ways that you could end up accessing a database. For most of my work, I end up using a command line. Maybe I'm missing something. The command line is nice because, again, muscle memory, it gets you used to writing SQL when you have to write it. So when we end up thinking about how our application works, right? We've got our server that's interacting with our backend. We've seen that we could end up accessing the file system where we end up using things like our static routes. So where does Postgres or any other database system end up sitting in? Well, we're going to have some way of accessing our Postgres database. And we've actually ended up doing this we haven't done this yet, but if this didn't exist, and what we wanted to do was access Postgres, we know that Postgres is actually somewhere down the line is writing somewhere. Something is being persisted, so it's writing things to the file system. So the question is, how do we end up getting there? Right? Where does that incoming SQL end up coming from? Right? So we could end up, writing SQL from our command line. We could use one of these GUIs, or we would like to have some way of actually accessing our Postgres database from our application. So, how to transmit SQL text to the app, how can Postgres be waiting to do this? So one of the things that's going to be happening here is that we're going to have this server that's running, and this server is going to end up listening to requests and sending back responses, right? And we've seen the connection string to this. So this is going to be a different type of a server. We've ended up using our HTTP server, But here we're going to end up using a TCP server, a different protocol to get our data. So one of the things that we'll end up seeing is that this type of transport protocol is going to be good for sending SQL requests and getting back data sets, as opposed to an HTTP protocol, which might be used for getting back JSON data or HTML. Right, two different protocols that end up getting used. So how can our JS app communicate with our Postgres server? So someone who is really ambitious might decide, well, let me implement the Postgres protocol and let me do it in JavaScript myself. And you could actually look and see what the protocol is. And anyone else that's reasonable is going to say there's got to be a library that exists already that allows me to do this. And this is what this PG module is going to end up doing for us. These are things that we ended up seeing in the demo already. So again, the idea that we could have a client, run a query. Again, you're seeing that syntax that I showed you before, where again, this is something that's happening asynchronous. Either you're going to get an error or you're going to end up getting data. Again, you see a callback here. You see a return from a callback function. You only use that when you just want to, again, get out of there, okay? If there's an error, boom, I'm done. If there's not an error, let me loop over my rows and let me see what my results are. And this ends up allowing us to complete this picture where we can end up basically interacting with our database by using this Postgres module, which again knows how to make these TCP/IP calls to our Postgres server. Again, assuming that it could end up finding it. If it can't, you'll end up getting an error message. So again, you're going to have Postgres running in order to do this. And the other thing, and we ended up seeing this as well, is that if in fact you end up inserting data like we did and you want to get the ID back, you've seen the syntax for that, and I'll actually push up that repo as well. So that's something you'll end up using for the workshop as well. Okay, let me stop this.